Cecil Harlow arrived at Aldenmore Castle before anyone had sent for him, and Harold Bates felt the wrongness of it the moment the carriage appeared at the end of the long drive. It was a Tuesday morning, not quite 11, cold and still, and Harold had been standing at the entrance hall window, doing his usual mental review of the day's arrangements, when the sound of wheels on the gravel reached him. He looked out, and his first thought was that someone had sent for a local tradesman. His second thought, when he saw the crest on the carriage door, was that something had gone badly wrong in a way he did not yet know how to name. He had been the steward of Aldenmore Castle for 12 years. He managed the correspondence. He oversaw every letter that left this house, and every instruction that governed what was said and to whom. Lady Beatrice had been explicit, in the 6 weeks since the Duke's illness began, that family members were not to be informed until she gave the word. The appropriate time, she had said more than once, had not yet come. Harold had accepted this as a household instruction, and managed his work accordingly. He had written no letter to Cecil, no letter to anyone. And yet here was Cecil, stepping down from the carriage, not looking at the house in the way a worried brother might look at the house of a man who was dying, but looking at it the way a man looks at a property he has arrived to inspect. Broad-shouldered, dark-eyed, composed, wearing the kind of coat that spoke of deliberate preparation for a significant occasion. Behind him came 2 men in matching dark coats, each carrying a leather folder, each moving with the careful efficiency of people who were there to do specific professional work. Behind them came 3 large leather trunks, unloaded by Cecil's personal staff, and stacked on the courtyard stones, as though they expected to stay a long while. Harold counted the trunks. He could not help it. 3. He straightened his jacket and went to the front door, and opened it before Cecil could raise his hand to the bell, because there was something about the situation that made Harold feel it was important to be precise and present from the very first moment. He stood in the doorway and said good morning, and welcomed Lord Cecil to Aldenmore. Cecil shook his hand once, briefly, and then said he needed to see his brother. He said it the way people say things when they are not really asking. Harold told him, keeping his expression smooth and professional, that Lady Beatrice had asked that the Duke not receive visitors, as the physicians believed that disturbance could slow the recovery, and that he would arrange a proper visit for the following morning, with Dr. Fenn present. Cecil looked at Harold with the dark Harlow eyes that were exactly the same as his brother's eyes, and yet entirely different behind them, and he said, very quietly, that he was not a visitor. He said he was Edmund's only living brother and nearest male relative. He said it without raising his voice, without any display of urgency or grief, which told Harold more than any raised voice would have. Harold said of course, and showed him to the East Wing guest rooms, and had the trunks brought up, and as he walked back through the main corridor, he thought about the word nearest, and the particular way it had been chosen. He found Lady Beatrice in the East drawing room, which was where she always was in the mornings, seated at the window with her tea, wearing a pale gray dress with her dark hair pinned in its usual perfect arrangement. The light came through the old wavy glass of the window, and lay across her face in stripes, and she looked, as she always looked, like someone who had already considered every possible development and had a plan for each one. She was 31 years old. She had been the Duchess of Aldenmore for 4 years. Harold had respected her efficiency deeply in the early years of her time here, and he was now discovering that respect and trust were not the same thing, and never had been. He told her about Cecil. He told her about the trunks and the solicitors. He told it plainly and in order, watching her face as he spoke. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she set her teacup down with a soft, precise click, and said that Cecil was to be given the East Wing rooms, that supper would be served for 5 at 7, and that the Duke was sleeping and could not be disturbed. She paused. Then she said, "Harold, do not leave Cecil or his men alone in the main rooms." She said it without elaboration, without any softening phrase, without explaining why, because Lady Beatrice had never in Harold's experience felt the need to explain her instructions to the person who carried them out. Harold went back and delivered the message. Cecil received it with a thin, polished smile and said that tomorrow morning would suit him perfectly. He asked whether supper was formal. Harold said it was informal. Cecil nodded and turned to one of his solicitors and said something in a low voice, and Harold walked away quickly enough to be plausibly out of earshot. Dr. Arthur Fenn arrived at 11, as he arrived every morning, with his black bag and his long-practiced manner of a man who carried the weight of difficult knowledge on behalf of those who could not bear it themselves. He was 58, silver-haired, meticulous, the kind of physician who inspired confidence in the people who needed it most, which Harold now understood was a tool as much as it was a quality. He went upstairs to the Duke's bedchamber and stayed for 40 minutes and came back down and found Harold in the corridor by the east staircase, where Harold had placed himself specifically to receive Fenn's report. "Stable," Fenn said. "Resting. No significant change." Harold thanked him. He watched him leave. He stood in the corridor alone for a moment and heard those words echo back through the past 6 weeks, each morning's identical report stacking against the previous ones, until they formed something that sounded less like a medical assessment and more like a door being held shut. 42 days. Not one morning where the same 2 words shifted to something better, or something different, or something that carried inside it any sense of the future. Just stable, just resting, just no significant change. Harold had trained himself, over 12 years of service, not to reach beyond what he was given. He was reaching now, and finding nothing to hold on to. The afternoon post arrived at 2:30, and Harold sorted it in his office as he always did, and came to an envelope addressed to Clarence Webb, the family solicitor in the village, that had been misdelivered to the castle. He knew immediately from the return address that it was misdelivered, and he knew immediately that he should set it aside and have it sent on with the next post. And he knew equally immediately that he was not going to do that. He stood at his desk with the envelope in his hand and made a decision that he had never made in 12 years, and he opened it. Oliver Harlow wrote clearly and without decoration. He was Edmund's son from the first marriage, 30 years old, absent from Aldenmore for 7 years, as a result of a dispute that had started as a business disagreement and grown into a permanent silence. He was writing about the will. Specifically, he was writing about the settlement document of 1881, which he called the prior arrangement, and he wanted to know whether its provisions were still active, and whether the codicil added at the time of the second marriage was legally binding in certain circumstances. He listed the circumstances without naming them. He asked about trusts and their conditions. He asked about what happened to the estate if no further legal instruments had been executed. He did not once write the word death. He did not need to. Harold refolded the letter, placed it back in its envelope, and put it in Clarence Webb's correspondence pile, with the deliberateness of a man who is doing a precise and careful thing. He went to the window at the end of his office and looked out at the south lawns, the ones the Duke had walked every afternoon for 20 years. They were empty and gray and wet in the November light. Harold stood there for a time, and then he went to find something productive to do with the rest of the afternoon, because there was nothing else available to him. Supper that evening was one of the most expertly managed performances Harold had ever witnessed in his professional life. Lady Beatrice sat at the head of the long dining table, and was warm and pleasant and entirely at ease, asking Cecil about his journey, about the roads from London, about the railway improvements he may have seen, about whether he had been in the country much lately, or was keeping mostly to London. Cecil was equally warm, equally pleasant, equally at ease, complimenting the wine and the food, and asking thoughtful follow-up questions that showed he had been listening. He recommended a variety of rose for the south garden that he had seen somewhere in Kent. She thanked him and said she would look into it. They talked for an hour and a half. They talked about everything in the world except Edmund, who lay upstairs with his trembling hands and his mottled skin and his 42 days of unchanging decline, and whose name was not once spoken at the table where his brother and his wife sat and were gracious to each other, in front of 2 solicitors and a steward who had never felt so profoundly alone at a supper table in his life. Harold served and refilled glasses and removed plates and said nothing. He watched the solicitors eating at the far end of the table and got nothing from their faces, which was the most professional thing about them. After supper, he went to the kitchen to review the morning arrangements, and the kitchen was exactly the place he needed and did not know he needed, because the kitchen at Aldenmore was the one room in the house where nothing was managed or arranged or performed, where the truth of the household rose to the surface, the way heat rises from a good fire. Dorothy was at the range, finishing the washing up with the thoroughness she applied to everything, and the 2 younger kitchen maids were stacking dishes, and George the footman was restoring the serving shelf, and at the end of the long table sat Ned Briggs, the 17-year-old apprentice from George Pennock's workshop in Graufeld, eating bread and broth with the quiet attention of a boy who had learned early that the best position in any room was the one where no one was watching you, while you were watching everyone else. Dorothy was talking about the Duke. She had been talking about the Duke in this kitchen for 6 weeks, in the particular way that people talk when they have a truth they cannot say anywhere else, and the kitchen is the only safe room for it. She was talking tonight with an additional force that Harold recognized as the result of something that had happened during the day, something she had seen, or heard, or been told, and he stood in the doorway and listened. She had cooked for the Duke for 9 years. She knew his appetite, with an intimacy that she felt gave her more relevant knowledge than any doctor who visited for 40 minutes a day. She knew that he had eaten 2 eggs and toast, and a rasher, and half a pot of tea every morning for 9 years, with the reliability of a clock. She knew that he had walked the south lawns every afternoon at 3, and come back with color in his face, and an appetite for his tea. She had watched him be healthy and active, and fully himself right up to the particular morning 8 weeks ago, when he had come down looking pale, and then the next morning, when he had not come down at all, and then the days and weeks of steady, uninterrupted decline that had followed. A well man does not go from walking 3 miles a day to bedridden in 10 days, Dorothy said. She said it to the range, and to the ceiling, and to anyone who cared to listen. She said that in her experience, which included the death of her own husband from a genuine heart condition, and the deaths of 3 brothers and 2 parents, and more patients than she could count in 15 years of work before she came to the kitchen. A heart that was giving out did not do so on a straight downward line, a little worse every morning, always the same direction, never a variance. A heart that was giving out struggled and fluctuated, and had its better days and its much worse days. What she had seen in the Duke for 8 weeks was not that. What she had seen was a perfectly straight line going in one direction, and never deviating from it. She said, "Dr. Fenn says what he says. I say what I see." The kitchen was very quiet when she finished. The maids studied the table. George adjusted something on the shelf. Harold stood in the doorway and felt something shift very slightly in the alignment of his understanding of everything that had been happening in this house for the past 6 weeks. Ned Briggs sat at the end of the table and ate the last of his bread and put down his bowl and folded his hands in his lap with the stillness of a boy who has understood something important and is deciding what to do with it. Harold said goodnight to the kitchen and went upstairs for his final rounds. He paused in the corridor outside the Duke's bedchamber and listened to the quiet inside, and then he went on to his own room and lay awake for the better part of 2 hours, which was unusual for him, because Harold Bates had always been a man who slept well, and the fact that he could not sleep was a kind of information he had not expected and did not entirely know how to use. In the room at the end of the east corridor, Clara Whitmore sat in her chair by the window and watched the Duke's hands. She had been sitting in this chair for 22 nights now, watching those hands, noting the particular quality of the trembling in them, the way it never stopped even in the Duke's deepest sleep, the way it had the steady, unvarying character of something that was being consistently caused, rather than something that was progressing of its own accord. She had filled the small notebook in her apron pocket with 44 entries across 22 days, 2 per day, recording the time of each observation and the quality of what she observed, and the notebook was now a document with a very clear shape to it, a shape that pointed in one direction and only one direction, and she had been looking at that shape for 9 days, and she was done deliberating about what it meant. She thought about Henry in Birmingham. She thought about the modeling on his skin, the same rust-brown pattern in the same location, and about what Dr. Aldred had said when he saw it, and about the tests he had ordered, and about what the results of those tests had named. She thought about what she had learned standing at the back of that ward 20 years ago, and she thought about the specific knowledge she had carried since then, in the careful, reliable storage of her professional mind. She looked at the Duke's neck, at the pattern there that Fenn had called a circulatory symptom, and she knew with a certainty that needed no further confirmation that it was not a circulatory symptom. Tomorrow, she thought, George Pennock and his apprentice would come back to finish the measurement that had not been completed today. She thought about that. She thought about the particular timing of it, the specific opportunity it represented, the fact that Pennock would serve as a witness in the simplest possible sense of the word, a person present in the room when something was said. She sat very still in the cold room, and watched the Duke breathe, thin and effortful and stubborn. And she made her decision the way she made all her decisions. Not in a moment of drama, but in a moment of plain, clear, uncomplicated certainty. She made it the way a person sets down something heavy, steadily, carefully, with full knowledge of what she was doing. Tomorrow, she would say it. In Graufeld, in his cold workshop with a lamp burning low on the workbench, George Pennock sat with the note from Lady Beatrice on the table in front of him, under the edge of a small wooden block that served as a paperweight. He had read it 4 times since it arrived. It said everything a note of this kind said, in the language that these notes always used, the language of practical arrangements made in advance of a death that was expected and approaching. He had received notes like it hundreds of times. They were the ordinary administrative paperwork of his profession, and he had never once looked at one with the feeling he was looking at this one. He could not explain the feeling, except that it was the feeling of a man who knows something is wrong and cannot point to the specific wrong thing. He would go in the morning, with Ned, and he would do his work, and it would be fine. He put out the lamp and walked home through the dark streets, and stood in his kitchen for a while, without lighting the lamp there either, just standing in the dark and the cold, and listening to the particular silence of a small house at night. And then he went to bed, and lay looking at the ceiling, and told himself there was nothing wrong, and that tomorrow would be an ordinary morning, and the job would be done. He did not sleep for a very long time. George Pennock had Ned at the workshop gate at 8 o'clock exactly, which was the time he had said, and the time Ned knew better than to be late for. The morning was the kind of November morning that makes no promises about improving, gray from one edge of the sky to the other, with a cold that sat in the air rather than blowing through it, the still, patient cold of a day that will simply remain cold until the dark returns. They harnessed the horse without talking much, because neither of them was a morning talker, and they set off for Aldenmore at 10 minutes past 8, with the cart wheels loud on the frozen road, and the horse's breath making little clouds that appeared and dissolved in the gray air ahead of them. Ned sat beside his employer on the bench, with his collar turned up and his hands in his coat pockets. He was 17, and he had been Pennock's apprentice for 2 years. He was not a talkative boy, which was one of the reasons Pennock had kept him. He worked well, and he listened well, and he did not ask questions that did not need asking, and in a profession like Pennock's, which was conducted mostly in the rooms of grieving families who needed quiet and order, and the sense that things were being handled with care and skill, those qualities were more valuable than any technical ability. Ned was also, as Pennock had observed over 2 years, extremely watchful. He noticed things. He filed them away without comment, and you could see him doing it. The slight shift of attention, the moment of stillness while he registered something, and then the return to whatever he had been doing before. Pennock had found this quality useful in the workshop, where errors in measurement or material had a way of being noticed by Ned before they became actual mistakes. He had not yet found it useful anywhere else, but he had a feeling, this morning, that today might be different. The road from Graufeld to Aldenmore was 6 miles of hard lane between old stone walls and bare hedgerows, and it took them nearly 50 minutes at the pace the horse could manage on the cold road. Pennock drove, and Ned looked at the fields on either side, and neither of them spoke about the job ahead, which was also the professional habit of a craftsman who had learned that there was nothing useful to say about a commission before you had seen the full situation and made your assessments. You spoke afterward, when you knew the measurements and had thought about the wood and decided on the joints. You did not speculate before. Aldenmore Castle came into view when they rounded the last curve of the drive, and it was a house that made a particular kind of impression on a person who had not seen it before. It was 3 stories of old stone, with very tall windows and a wide front door, and the particular settled solidity of a building that had been in the same place for 250 years, and had absorbed into its walls the weight of everything that had happened inside it. Ned looked at it for a long time as they came up the drive, with the particular focused attention he gave to things he was seeing for the first time, and then he looked at Pennock, who was looking at the house with a different expression, more private and harder to read. Harold Bates met them at the front door and introduced himself with the quiet, efficient courtesy of a man who was very good at managing situations that were both sad and practical, which was what a steward of a great house in these circumstances needed to be. He was a tall man, carefully dressed, with a face that gave very little away, but gave, Ned thought, just enough to confirm that the man behind it was working hard at something difficult, He shook Pennick's hand and gave Ned a brief nod and showed them inside. The entrance hall was large and cold and very quiet, with oil portraits of men and women who had stood in this hall through a different century, looking down from the walls with the particular calm of people who have nothing to lose anymore. Ned noticed the fresh flowers on the side table, which struck him as a strange arrangement in a house where a man was dying upstairs. Not the flowers of grief, which were white and formal, but ordinary autumn flowers that someone had put there as a matter of maintaining normal household appearances. He noticed the solicitor's cases stacked near the foot of the staircase, 2 of them, fat with documents. He noticed a coat on the rack that belonged to someone other than the Duke, and a pair of shoes beside the umbrella stand that were too new and too London polished for the countryside. Harold led them through the entrance hall and to the east drawing room and asked them to wait. He spoke quietly, and with a kind of deliberate ordinariness that Ned recognized, after a moment, as the voice of someone who was trying to make everything seem normal, in a situation that was becoming progressively less so. He said that Lady Beatrice would come shortly to speak with them before they went upstairs. He said he would have tea sent in. He left. The drawing room was pale and elegant and extremely still. Pennick stood in the middle of it with his rope coiled in one hand, and looked at the window and the garden beyond it, which was bare and winter gray, the beds cut back and covered, the paths empty. Ned stood near the door, and watched the corridor through the open doorway, and listened to the sounds of the house. There were several sounds. There was a man's voice, somewhere in the east wing, speaking in short sentences, the voice of someone conducting business rather than visiting. There was the occasional sound of footsteps on the upper floor, back and forth, slow and measured. There was the distant sound of the kitchen, very faint, which in any house is the sound of the house being alive, and which here sounded, to Ned's ear, slightly different from how it should, more controlled, more careful, as though even the ordinary work of the kitchen was being done with someone listening. Lady Beatrice came in after 10 minutes. Ned watched her cross the room and noticed several things in the first few seconds. That she moved with a precision that was not grace exactly, but something more deliberate than grace. Each step placed as though she had thought about where she was putting her foot. That her face was composed in the way that very practiced composure looks, which is slightly different from natural composure. Just a fraction too consistent, just a fraction too even. That she looked at Pennick first and then at Ned, and that the look she gave Ned lasted a fraction of a second longer than was quite usual for a person looking at a servant's boy, as though she were assessing what he noticed and deciding whether it mattered. She thanked Pennick for coming. She said the situation was a sad one, but that certain practical arrangements had to be made, and that she would rather they were made with care and good judgment than left to chance. She said the Duke was resting, and that the nursing sister would be in the room, and that Pennick was to be as quiet and as quick as possible, and that if the Duke was disturbed in any way, the visit would need to end immediately. Pennick said he understood, and had done this kind of work many times, and would be as careful as he could be. She looked at him for a moment longer than she needed to, and then said Harold would take them up, and she left. Pennick looked at Ned. Ned looked back at him. Neither of them said anything. Harold came and led them to the main staircase, and up to the first floor, where the corridor was wider than in most houses of this age, and lined with old carpet that absorbed their footsteps completely, so that they moved through the upper hallway as quietly as the corridor wanted them to move. The walls up here were hung with more portraits, and side tables bore small lamps that were lit against the November morning gray, and everything was very well ordered and very quiet and very still, and the quality of the stillness was the particular quality of a house that is waiting for something. Harold paused at a door at the far end of the corridor and knocked once, very softly, and then opened it and stood aside. Pennick went in first. The room was large and cool and smelled of medicine and the particular stillness of air that has been breathed and rebreathed by someone who is not moving much. The smell that Pennick knew from hundreds of rooms in 40 years. The smell that was not unpleasant, but that was unmistakable. The curtains were half drawn, letting in the gray November light in a way that was neither bright nor dim, but exactly the quality of light that made everything in the room visible without demanding attention. The bed was against the far wall, a large old bed with dark carved posts, and in the bed, beneath a heavy cream coverlet, was the Duke. Pennick looked at him with the attention that 40 years had made automatic. He was thin, not the thinness of a man who had always been slender, but the acquired thinness of a man from whom something had been taken, the thinness of absence. His face was pale with the specific pallor that comes from weeks without proper exposure to light and air. His hair, what remained of it on the pillow, was sparse. His hands lay on the coverlet, and even from the doorway Pennock could see the fine, unceasing tremor in them, the trembling that did not stop even in the deepest quiet. He looked at all of this with his professional eye, the eye that had been trained across 40 years to do a precise and particular kind of seeing, and he thought, yes, this is a man who is very unwell. And then, beneath that professional assessment, without his permission, and without any rational basis he could have explained to anyone, he thought something else entirely. He thought, this is a man who is not finished. He had felt it before, twice in his long career. The sense of standing beside a person whose body was failing badly, and who nonetheless had not, in some essential and entirely unscientific sense, reached the end of what they were going to do. He could not define it more precisely than that. He had no language for it that would satisfy a medical man or a court of law. He had only the 40 years of standing in rooms like this one, and the particular certainty that came, sometimes, without warning or explanation, in the way that certainty sometimes does. He moved his gaze from the Duke. The woman in the chair by the window had been there when they entered, and had not moved when the door opened. She was seated in a straight-backed wooden chair, with her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes on Pennock and Ned, with a steadiness that was not unfriendly, but was very complete. She was perhaps in her mid-40s, plain-featured, wearing the dark dress and white apron of a nursing sister, and there was something about the quality of her watching that made Pennock feel, unusually, that the most important examination happening in this room was not the one he was conducting. Harold whispered an introduction. This was Sister Whitmore, who had been attending the Duke for 3 weeks. She was available if there were any questions about the patient's current condition. Pennock nodded to her. She nodded back. Her eyes did not change. Pennock moved toward the bed. Ned followed, notebook open, pencil ready. Harold positioned himself inside the door, to one side, where he could see the whole room. The only sound was the Duke's breathing, and the distant sound of the winter wind in the chimney above. Pennock uncoiled the rope. He held one end at the foot of the bed, near the Duke's feet, and began to extend it toward the headboard, making the first measurement, and his hands worked with the steadiness of a craftsman who has done this motion 10,000 times and whose body knows it independently of his mind. He noted the length. He handed the end of the rope to Ned, who wrote the number in the notebook without being asked, because this too was the procedure they always followed, a procedure so well established between them that it required no instruction. Pennock moved to the side of the bed. He measured the width of the Duke at the shoulder. He moved the rope to the chest. He was working quickly and quietly, as he had promised, and the Duke did not stir, and the room was very still, and Harold watched from the door, and Ned wrote numbers in his notebook, and Clara Whitmore sat in her chair and watched all of them. Pennock did not look at the nursing sister again while he worked, but he was aware of her. He was aware of the quality of her attention in the room, the way you are aware of a sound that is not intrusive but is always there, and it sat at the edge of his concentration the whole time he was working, a kind of quiet alertness that was not his own, but that he could feel in the air of the room, as though it were a weather condition. He measured the width of the Duke at the hip. He measured the length again from a different reference point to confirm the first measurement. He noted both numbers. He handed the rope to Ned, and Ned wrote in the notebook, and in the careful, practiced silence of two people who work well together, there was something almost peaceful about the way they moved around the bed, professional and quiet and precise. And then the chair beside the window made a soft sound. It was the sound of someone standing up. Not quickly, not with urgency, but with the deliberateness of someone who has waited for the right moment and has decided this is it. Pennock looked up from the rope. Clara Whitmore was crossing the room. Clara Whitmore had come to nursing the way most things of lasting importance come to people who are not looking for them, through necessity and circumstance, and the particular quiet persistence of a person who notices what needs to be done and does it before being asked. She was the youngest of 4 children of a schoolmaster in Derbyshire, raised in a house that had books and principle and very little money, and from an early age, she had been the one in the family who noticed when something was wrong before anyone else did, who registered the slight change in a face, or a sound, or a quality of air, that signaled that ordinary life was about to be interrupted. She had been 16 when her mother developed a fever that lasted 3 weeks and might very easily have lasted longer. The village doctor came on the 2nd day and on the 7th day and prescribed a cooling draft and said to keep the patient comfortable and send for him if anything changed significantly. Clara had sent for him precisely once, when the fever rose sharply on the 12th night, and he had come and done what he could and left again. And for the remaining days of her mother's illness, Clara had managed the care herself. She had managed it by reading everything she could get her hands on, by borrowing medical texts from her father's colleague at the school 2 streets over, by writing a letter to the county hospital asking for guidance that arrived 2 weeks after the crisis had passed, and by sitting at her mother's bedside through the nights and watching, carefully, everything that happened, noting what appeared to help and what did not, adjusting what she was doing, based on what she observed. Her mother recovered. The doctor who came back to see her on the 22nd day looked at Clara with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life. It was not congratulation. It was not even acknowledgement. It was the very particular look of a man who has had his territory trespassed upon and does not know what to do about it because the trespasser has done nothing wrong. He wrote in his notes that the fever had run its natural course, and the patient had responded well to rest. He said nothing to Clara at all. Clara had filed that look away and thought about it sometimes, in later years, when she encountered that same expression again, in different faces in different rooms, and she always felt exactly the same thing in response to it. A calm, complete certainty that she knew what she was doing, that the evidence in front of her was real, and that no amount of professional displeasure in someone else's expression was going to change either of those facts. She had trained as a nursing sister at 18 at the charitable hospital in Derby, and had worked there for 4 years before accepting a post at a larger institution in Birmingham, where she spent the next 12 years of her professional life. Birmingham was where she met Dr. Charles Aldred, and where she stood at the back of a ward at the age of 32, and learned something that no textbook had ever given her. A factory worker named Henry Croft had been brought into the men's ward after collapsing at his place of work. He was 24 years old, and the doctors who initially examined him attributed his collapse to a fever of unknown origin. This was a reasonable first assessment, and it was wrong. Dr. Aldred was a small, gray, quiet man who visited the ward not as the primary physician, but as a consulting specialist, and he had been in practice for 35 years and had read more widely than anyone Clara had ever met in medicine. He walked into the ward on the 3rd day of Henry's admission and went directly to Henry's bedside and stood there for 2 minutes without saying anything. Clara was nearby, adjusting the chart at the next bed, and she watched him without appearing to watch him, which was one of her professional skills. He asked the junior physician for the history and listened to it, and then he asked 2 questions. Had anyone measured the patient's urine output, and had anyone looked carefully at the skin on the patient's neck and chest? The junior physician looked uncertain and said the chart covered the standard assessments. Aldred said he would like to look at the patient himself. He pulled back Henry's collar, carefully and with the respectful handling that marked everything Aldred did, and he looked at the skin below the collar, and his expression, which had been neutral throughout, became very slightly more focused. He asked Clara, who was the nursing sister on duty, to step outside the ward with him for a moment. He asked her what she had observed. He listened to everything she said without interrupting, and then he asked her the same question he had asked the physician. Had she noticed anything particular about the skin on the patient's neck and chest? She said yes, she had noticed a pattern there that she had thought was discoloration from the fever. He asked her to describe the pattern in detail. She described it. He listened, and then he explained, clearly and without condescension, what the pattern was, and what it indicated, and how you distinguished it from other possible causes. He told her the name of the compound he suspected, and why he suspected it, and what tests would confirm or refute the suspicion. He sent the test request within the hour. 3 days later, Henry's employer was arrested. Clara had stood at the back of the ward and watched every part of what followed, and she had listened to every conversation she was in a position to overhear, and she had kept everything in the careful and reliable library of her professional mind, where it sat for 12 years without fading. She had not forgotten the name of the compound. She had not forgotten the description of the pattern. She had not forgotten the specific timing of the symptoms, or the particular mechanism of their progression. She had not forgotten the way Aldred had asked her what she had observed before he formed his own conclusions, which told her everything she needed to know about what kind of doctor he was, and why he was the one who had seen what everyone else had missed. She had arrived at Aldenmore 22 days ago, expecting to care for a man who was dying of a weakness of the heart, which was what Dr. Fenn had told the household she would find. She had come prepared for that work. She had her own method for this kind of care, developed over 20 years, and it began with observation. Patient, thorough, unrushed observation. Before she did anything else, what she observed in the first 48 hours did not match the clinical picture of cardiac failure. The trembling in the Duke's hands was not a feature of the cardiac presentation she had expected. It was consistent, not variable, and it had the character of something being maintained rather than something progressing. The mottling she found on his skin on the second day, when she changed his shirt, was not a symptom she associated with any form of cardiac condition, and when she described it carefully in her notebook she included a note: does not match known cardiac presentations, requires explanation. She asked Dr. Fenn about it on her fourth day, phrasing the question with the care she always used when asking a question that the other person might not want to answer. Fenn looked at the skin and said it was poor circulation, a known effect of the compromised cardiac function. He used the correct terminology and looked at her steadily and moved on without lingering. She made a note of his answer and went back to her chair. The mornings were where the pattern became unmistakable to her. She noticed on her fifth day that the Duke's worst hours followed a consistent schedule. Between roughly 6 and 10 in the morning, specifically in the hour to hour and a half after the morning broth was brought, his trembling intensified, his consciousness dimmed, his color worsened, and he sank into the particular exhausted, resistant sleep of a body that was dealing with an additional burden on top of its own struggle. She was aware that morning is often the hardest time for a patient with any serious condition, and she factored that in. What she could not factor in, after watching it repeat across 5, 10, 15 mornings, was the consistency of the timing and the specific correlation with the broth. Lady Beatrice brought the broth herself every morning. This had struck Clara from the first morning as unusual, and she had watched it closely from the second. A duchess with a full household of kitchen staff and footmen, and a nursing sister on permanent duty, had no practical reason to personally deliver a cup of morning broth to her husband. But Beatrice came every morning, always before the kitchen staff appeared, always carrying the cup in her own hands, always staying beside the bed while the Duke drank it, always taking the cup away herself when he was done. She did not leave the cup for Clara to deal with. She did not ask Clara to hold it while the Duke rested between sips. She held it herself, and she removed it herself. Clara noted this in the notebook on the first morning she observed it. She noted it every morning thereafter, with the time and the duration and the observation that followed within the hour. The notebook now had 44 entries, and every pair of entries on every day told exactly the same story, varying only in small details, consistent in its fundamental pattern. She knew what the pattern meant. She had known for 9 days. She had been waiting, with the particular patience of a woman who had learned that being right was not the same as being heard, and that hearing required witnesses, and that witnesses in a situation like this were not easy to find inside the house where the situation was occurring. George Pennock was crossing the room toward the Duke's bed now, his rope in hand, his apprentice behind him. Harold Bates was at the door. There were 3 witnesses in this room. 2 of them did not know it yet. Clara sat in her chair and watched Pennock work, and she thought about everything she had built across 22 days. Every entry in the notebook, every morning's observation, every careful distinction between what she had seen and what she concluded from it. And she thought about the cost of what she was about to say, and she weighed it, one last time, and found that it was not actually a choice at all. There had never been a choice. You observed, you concluded, you named what you saw, you said it out loud. That was what nursing was. That was what all of it had always been, from her mother's bedroom in Derbyshire, to the ward in Birmingham, to this cold, quiet room in Aldenmore Castle, on a grey November morning. She watched Pennock measure the width of the Duke at the shoulder. She watched Ned write numbers in the notebook. She watched Harold stand at the door with his hands at his sides and his face very still. She watched the Duke's hands on the coverlet, trembling in the way they always trembled, with the awful steadiness of something that should not be steady. She looked at the pattern on the Duke's neck, visible above the line of his nightshirt collar, the dark, rust-brown mottling, that had been there since her second day, and that was not cardiac, and had never been cardiac, and that Fen had named wrong on her fourth day, with steady eyes and a smooth explanation, and the particular confidence of a man who has a great deal to lose if the right question is asked too insistently. She thought about Henry Croft, about Dr. Aldrid's steady voice asking her what she had observed, about the test results, and the arrest, and the 24-year-old man who had walked out of that ward alive, and who would not have, if no one had said it. She stood up. She crossed the room without hurrying and without hesitation, moving in a straight line from the window chair to the side of the bed where George Pennock stood with his rope, and she moved with the quality of someone who has made a decision that is now fully made and requires only its execution. Pennock looked up from the measurement he was making, and his hands went still, and he looked at her. Ned looked up from the notebook. Harold, at the door, shifted slightly. Clara did not look at any of them. She lowered herself to her knees beside the bed, not in prayer, not in attendance, but in the specific posture of someone who needs to be close to something they are going to examine. She knelt on the cold stone floor beside the mattress, and she put her left hand on the edge of the coverlet, and with her right hand, she very gently drew back the collar of the Duke's nightshirt from his neck, exposing the skin below the jaw and across the collarbone and down the upper chest. She held the fabric back, and she looked at what was there. The modeling was as it had always been. 22 days of observing it had not made it less significant. It was a dark, rust-brown discoloration in a specific pattern, not the random modeling of poor circulation, not the flush of fever, but a particular distribution that lay across the skin, with the consistency of something that had been caused by the same agent over the same area, and repeated across weeks of exposure. She had looked at it every day. She looked at it now with the same attention, though what she was looking for today was not more information, but the final confirmation that what she was about to say was as right as she believed it to be. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked up at George Pennock. He was standing very still, with the rope hanging from his right hand, and he was looking at the skin she was showing him, and his face had changed. It was not a dramatic change. He was not a man given to dramatic changes of expression. But the professional composure that had been there a moment ago had shifted, and what was underneath it was something rawer and less manageable. The face of a man who is seeing something that contradicts what he came here to do, and does not yet know what to do with the contradiction. Clara said, quietly, so that her voice filled the room without being loud, "Put your rope away." The room was completely still. The Duke breathed on in his slow, effortful way, unchanged by anything happening around him. Outside the window, the gray November morning made no sound. The lamp on the bedside table did not flicker. Everything was absolutely still. Clara said, "This man is not dying of a weakness of the heart. The pattern on his skin is not circulatory. The trembling in his hands is not a side effect of cardiac medication. I have watched his condition across 22 days, and I have recorded what I have seen in a notebook that I will produce to anyone who asks for it. The worsening I have observed follows a consistent schedule that correlates precisely with the introduction of something that should not be there. This man is being given something that is destroying him. If what is being given to him is not stopped, he will not survive the month." She still did not look away from Pennock while she said it. She held his gaze with her gray eyes, steady and absolutely certain, and her voice did not waver on a single word, because there was nothing in what she was saying that she was uncertain about. And certainty, she had learned over 20 years, is something that people can hear in a voice even when they cannot account for hearing it. Pennock stared at her for a moment, then he looked at the skin she was showing him. He looked at the modeling, at its color and its distribution, at the way it lay across the Duke's neck and collarbone in the pattern she was pointing out. He looked at the trembling hands on the coverlet. He was not a physician, and he could not read what he was seeing with medical precision, but he could feel the truth of it in the same way he could feel the quality of wood or the true level of a surface, some deep physical knowledge that came from long experience and did not require formal language to be real and reliable. He let the rope drop, not carelessly but deliberately. He let it fall from his hand and hang at his side, and then he lowered it further and set it on the floor beside him. Harold Bates had not moved from the doorway. He had been watching everything with the stillness of a man who knows something significant is happening and has not yet found the words for it. When the rope touched the floor, he said nothing. His face had lost some of its color. He was doing something behind his eyes, some rapid and private reassessment of everything he had understood about this household for the past 6 weeks, and the reassessment was not a comfortable one. Ned Briggs stood at the foot of the bed with his pencil poised above the open notebook, and had stopped writing at the moment Clara stood from her chair, and he had not moved since. He was looking at the nursing sister with the same careful, total attention he had given Dorothy in the kitchen the previous evening. The attention of a young man who has understood that he is in the presence of something important, and is making sure he will remember every detail of it correctly. Pennock said, very quietly, "What do we do?" It was not a question with a question mark. It was the statement of a man who has accepted a situation he did not expect, and is now completely present in it, ready to do whatever the situation requires. Clara drew the Duke's collar back into place, gently, taking care not to disturb him. She stood up from the floor, and smoothed her apron, and folded her hands, and looked from Pennock to Harold. She said, "There is a man named Inspector Frederick Oakes at the county offices. I need to write him a letter. I need you, Harold, to make sure that letter is sent by the fastest available post. I need you to allow me the time to write it, before anything else changes in this household." Harold looked at her. Something moved in his face that was not easy to name. The particular expression of a man who has spent 12 years being loyal to an institution, and is discovering, in a very short time, that loyalty and truth are not always pointing in the same direction. He said, "I will need a moment." She said, "Take a moment. But be aware that he has been getting worse every morning for 6 weeks, and that this morning has already happened, and that tomorrow morning will also happen, unless something changes before it does." Harold was quiet for a moment. He looked at the Duke in the bed. He looked at the Duke's hands, the trembling that did not stop, the fine constant shaking of fingers that had once shaken other hands with a grip firm enough to be remarked upon. He looked at those hands for a long time. Then he looked at Clara and said, "I will make sure your letter is sent, but we need to be careful about how this proceeds. If we move without enough to support it, we will be dismissed before we can do any good." Clara said, "I have a notebook with 44 entries and 22 days of documented observations. I have specific knowledge from a previous case that directly informs what I am seeing here. I have watched the same pattern repeat across 15 consecutive mornings. If that is not enough to write a letter to an inspector and ask him to look at it, I do not know what would be." Harold took a breath. He said, "Write your letter." Ned had been so still during all of this that Harold had nearly forgotten he was in the room. He spoke then, for the first time since they had arrived. He spoke quietly, with the particular directness of a young person who has not yet learned to cushion the things he says. He said, "My employer's rope is still on the floor." Everyone looked at the rope, coiled on the cold stone beside the bed. Pennock reached down and picked it up. He held it in both hands and looked at it for a moment. Then he rolled it back into a neat coil and held it at his side and said, without looking at anyone in particular, that he would not be completing any measurements today. He said it simply, as a statement of fact, the way he made all statements of fact. He said it, and it was said, and there was nothing more to add. And then, from the corridor outside the room, came the sound of footsteps on the upper hallway. Measured footsteps, precise and unhurried, coming from the direction of the main staircase. Harold turned toward the door. Clara looked at Pennock. Ned looked at the door. The footsteps came closer and stopped, and the door, which Harold had left slightly ajar, was pushed fully open. Lady Beatrice Harlow stood in the doorway. She looked at the four of them in a single sweeping assessment that took perhaps 2 seconds and registered everything. Pennock, with the rope coiled in his hands, Ned with the notebook open, Harold with his face the color of old paper, Clara, standing in the middle of the room with her hands folded and her posture perfectly straight. She looked at all of this, and then she looked at Clara with the particular look that a person uses when they have identified the problem in a room and are about to address it. She said, in her even, composed voice, "What is happening here?" Clara said, "I am glad you have come, Lady Beatrice. There are things I need to say to you, and I would rather say them directly than have them reach you through someone else." Beatrice looked at her. Clara said them. She said them plainly and in order, standing in the middle of the room with the Duke behind her, and her voice was steady, and her hands were folded, and she did not raise her voice or lower it, and she did not use any language that was anything other than precise and factual. She said what she had observed. She said what she concluded. She said what she believed needed to happen. She did not say the word accusation, because it was not necessary, because the observations she described were themselves an accusation, and everyone in the room understood this perfectly. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Lady Beatrice looked at her for a long moment. She was composed in a way that was now, to Clara, unmistakable for what it was. Not the composure of a grieving wife who had nothing to hide, but the composure of a woman who has anticipated this moment and prepared for it. It was the composure of preparation, not of innocence. Clara knew the difference. She had spent 20 years in rooms where people were dealing with things they did not want to be dealing with, and innocence and preparation had very different textures. Beatrice said that she appreciated Sister Whitmore's dedication. She said that in her experience, when a patient did not improve despite attentive care, the person providing the care could sometimes find themselves looking for explanations that were not there. She said this with the practiced kindness of someone delivering a difficult thing gently. She said she would ask Dr. Fenn to come immediately and speak to Sister Whitmore about the diagnosis and clear up any confusion. Clara said she had already spoken to Dr. Fenn. Beatrice said he would speak to her again. There was a pause of perhaps 3 seconds. Then Beatrice looked at Harold and said she would need a moment with Sister Whitmore privately, and Harold should take the coffin maker and his assistant downstairs and see that they had tea. Harold looked at Clara. Clara gave a very small nod. Harold went to Pennock and Ned and gestured toward the door with quiet efficiency, and they followed him out, Ned glancing back once as he left, and then the door closed and Clara and Beatrice were alone in the room, with the Duke and the gray November morning, and the sound of the Duke's thin, stubborn, undefeated breathing. Beatrice and Clara looked at each other across the room, and the look lasted longer than looks between people who have nothing to fear from each other tend to last. The Duke breathed on between them, slow and effortful and steady, and outside the window, the gray morning sat exactly as it had been sitting for the past hour, entirely indifferent to what was happening inside the room. Beatrice was the first to speak, and what she said was this. She said that Clara was a very good nursing sister, and that her dedication to the Duke's care had been evident throughout her time at Aldenmore. She said that she understood this situation was distressing for someone in Clara's position, watching a patient fail to improve despite the best of care. She said that when medical outcomes did not match our hopes, it was a natural human response to look for reasons outside the course of the illness itself, and that she had seen this pattern in the relatives and carers of the sick before, and she understood it without judgment. She said all of this with the warm, level authority of someone who has rehearsed something thoroughly enough that the rehearsal is no longer audible. Clara listened without interrupting. When Beatrice finished, Clara said, "I am not looking for reasons outside the illness. I am describing what I have observed inside it, across 22 days, in a documented record that I will share with anyone who asks. I am not speaking from distress, or from a hope that has not been met. I am speaking from 20 years of clinical experience, and a specific knowledge of the presentation I am looking at. I know what I am seeing. I knew it on my 8th day here. I have spent 14 more days confirming it, because I understood that certainty was required before this conversation could happen." Something very slight moved in her face, so slight that it would have been invisible to anyone who was not looking for it. Clara was looking for it. Then Beatrice said, "I am going to send for Dr. Fenn, and I would ask you, in the meantime, to return to your duties, and not to discuss any of this with the household staff." Clara said, "Of course." Beatrice left. Clara went back to her chair and sat down, and took out her notebook and wrote 2 lines in it, recording the time of the conversation and its content in the compressed but precise shorthand she used for all her entries. She wrote without drama and without haste, and without any sign that her hands were anything other than steady, because they were steady, because she had known this conversation was coming, and had been preparing for it for 9 days, and had expected it to be exactly what it had been, and being prepared for a thing she had learned over 20 years was the only way to meet it without losing anything important. Fenn arrived 50 minutes later. He came up the back staircase rather than the main one, which was unusual, and entered the Duke's room by the servants' door, which was also unusual, and stood in the middle of the room for a moment before he spoke. And in that moment, Clara observed several things. She observed that he had dressed too quickly, that his collar was slightly off-center, and his cuffs not quite level, suggesting he had come to the castle with more urgency than he was now pretending to have. She observed that he held his bag in his left hand rather than his right, which was not his habit, as though his right hand was occupied with something that was not there. She observed that his face had the particular smoothness of a man who has composed himself carefully before entering a room, and whose composure is being maintained by deliberate effort rather than natural ease. He said he had heard that she had some concerns about the Duke's condition, and he was happy to address them. He said it in the tone he always used with her, the tone of a senior physician addressing a nursing sister whose opinion was valued in the appropriate professional way, which was to say, valued within the specific and limited scope of nursing, which was itself a scope defined by the medical profession, and not by the nurses within it. Clara had been addressed in this tone for 20 years by many different physicians, and she felt nothing in response to it except the familiar, complete indifference that long experience produces. She asked him about the modeling again. She described it once more, carefully, with reference to its location, and its distribution, and the length of time she had observed it. She asked him whether he had ordered any investigative tests during his 6 weeks of treating the patient. She asked this question as neutrally as she had ever asked any question in her professional life, and she watched his face while she asked it. Fenn explained the modeling as circulatory, as he had before. He explained the absence of investigative testing as appropriate to the clinical picture he had established, which he believed was sufficiently clear as to make further testing redundant rather than necessary. He used the correct words, he maintained eye contact, he gave her everything except what she had actually asked for, which was an explanation that made sense of what she had seen. Then she asked him the question she had been saving. She said, "Dr. Fenn, in your clinical judgment, is there any possibility that the Duke's symptoms are consistent with the prolonged presence of an external compound in his system? Is that something you have considered and ruled out? And if so, on what basis have you ruled it out?" She watched his face when she asked it. She watched it with the same total attention she had been giving to the Duke's hands for 22 mornings. Fenn's face was very good, very practiced, very controlled. But the left eye tightened by a fraction, and the hands that had been perfectly still at his sides shifted very slightly, and there was a pause of perhaps half a second between her question and the beginning of his answer that was half a second too long, given the smooth authority with which he had answered every other question. It was there. She saw it. She filed it away in the notebook in her mind, where it would stay undisturbed until it was needed. He said that he had considered and ruled out all alternative explanations, consistent with the patient's history and current presentation, and that he was satisfied that the cardiac diagnosis was correct. He said it with full, steady authority. He said it the way a person says something that is both completely controlled and completely false. Clara thanked him. She said she appreciated his time and the clarity of his explanation. She did not say anything else. Fenn left. Clara sat for a moment in the chair and breathed. Then she stood up and began, quietly, to move around the room, doing the small tasks of her morning care routine, adjusting the coverlet and checking the lamp and making a note on the Duke's chart in the way she always did. And while she did these things, she thought about Harold and about what Harold was doing right now, and whether he was thinking the same thing she was thinking, and whether he was going to be the kind of man who did what needed to be done when it needed to be done, or the kind of man who did what was safe. The answer came an hour later, when Harold appeared in the doorway and looked at her with an expression that told her something had happened or was about to happen, and he said, very quietly, that Lady Beatrice had decided that Sister Whitmore's services were no longer required at Aldenmore. He said the wages for the full month had been arranged, and a cart would be ready in 30 minutes to take her to the village. He said he was sorry. He said it and meant it, and the meaning sat plainly in his face, and Clara looked at it and understood that Harold was sorry, and that being sorry was not the same as being able to change it, and that he was not, right now, the kind of man who could change it. Not in this house. Not yet. She said she understood. She began to pack. She packed with the efficiency of someone who has packed and unpacked in a great many different rooms over a long professional life, and has no emotional attachment to the process. She folded her clothes and placed them in the bag, and collected the small objects that were hers from the surface of the dressing table and the windowsill of the small adjacent room that had served as her sleeping quarters. And she moved through all of this with steady hands and a clear mind, because she had already made the decision she needed to make, and the packing was simply the next step in executing it. The notebook went into the inside pocket of her traveling coat, pressed against her body, where it was least likely to be misplaced, or lost, or taken. A footman named George came to carry her bag. She thanked him without embarrassment, because the situation was not embarrassing, it was simply the situation. She followed him down the main staircase. As she passed through the entrance hall, she saw, through the partially open door of the east drawing room, George Pennock and Ned Briggs still seated inside, still waiting with the rope and the notebook in the particular patient stillness of two people who have nowhere else to be and are therefore entirely present where they are. Ned looked up when she passed the doorway. She met his eyes briefly and gave him the smallest possible nod. He gave nothing back that she could read, but she thought she had seen the quality of his attention change for a moment, the way the quality of attention does when something is registered and stored. The footman carried her bag to the front door and set it on the step and held the door. She walked out into the November morning, and the door closed behind her. She stood in the stone courtyard in the cold air and breathed. The drive stretched out ahead of her toward the gateposts. The castle rose behind her, old and solid and silent, and she stood at the front of it and thought, quite clearly, about what she was going to do. She heard the front door open behind her. She did not turn. Cecil Harlow said her name. He said it with the careful, interested tone of someone who had been watching from an upper window and had come down quickly. She turned then. He was standing in the doorway with his coat on, dressed as though he had been about to go out or had just returned, which she doubted, and he was looking at her with those dark Harlow eyes that reminded her of the Duke's eyes, and yet were nothing like them. He said, "I have been made aware of what has occurred." He said it without specifying how he had been made aware, which told her that someone in the household had told him, which told her that the household was watching all of this more carefully than its composed surface suggested. He said that he might be in a position to assist her. She looked at him. She thought about Cecil Harlow arriving with solicitors and leather trunks and questions about the estate ledgers before anyone had sent for him. She thought about Oliver Harlow's letter asking about the will. She thought about the particular kind of assistance that men in Cecil's position offered, which was almost always the kind of assistance that served their own ends while appearing to serve yours. She said, "Thank you, Lord Cecil. I do not need assistance." She picked up her bag. She walked down the drive. She went through the stone gateposts and onto the road to Graufeld without looking back, and the cold morning air was sharp in her lungs, and her feet were steady on the hard road, and her mind was already at the writing desk at the inn, composing the first sentence of the letter to Inspector Oakes, because that was the work, and the work was what mattered, and it was the only thing she needed to be thinking about right now. Harold Bates stood at the upper landing window and watched her go, and he was very still for a long time, and when she had disappeared from sight, he went to his office and sat down at his desk, and sat there for several minutes without touching anything. Then he took out a piece of paper and began to write. Not a letter, not an instruction, not a ledger entry. He wrote down, in careful order, everything he had observed in this house for the past 6 weeks, and what he thought it meant, and what he thought he should have done and when, and why he had not done it. And at the bottom of the page he wrote, today's date, and he folded the page and put it in the inside drawer of his desk and locked the drawer. Then he went about his afternoon, because the afternoon was there and required attending to, and attending to what was required was the only thing available to him until something else became possible. The Anchor Inn in Graufeld had 11 rooms and a smell of old timber and pipe smoke and coal fires that was not unpleasant, and the room Clara was given on the second floor had a window that looked out over the village square and a writing desk beneath the window that was exactly what she needed. She paid for 3 nights in advance, which surprised the innkeeper slightly, and then she went upstairs and sat down at the desk without taking off her coat. She took out the notebook. She opened it to the first entry, which she had made on the morning of her second day at Aldenmore, and she read through all 44 entries from beginning to end, carefully, without skipping anything. She was looking for 2 things: errors and gaps. Errors, because if she had written something down wrongly in the shorthand of a tired night nurse at 3 in the morning, and was going to attribute that observation to her notebook as a reliable record, she needed to know about the error before anyone else did. Gaps, because a record with unexplained gaps was a record with unanswered questions, and unanswered questions, in the middle of an account, were the single most effective tool anyone had for discrediting the account entirely. There were no errors. The notebook was what it was: 44 entries across 22 days, each one dated and timed. each one recording what she had observed in the precise and unornamented language that she had been trained to use for clinical notes. The entries did not contain opinions. They did not contain conclusions. They contained observations, stated in the language of observation, which was the plainest and most reliable language she knew. There were no significant gaps. There was one morning, the 11th, when she had slept through the early hours in the adjacent room because she had been awake from midnight until 4 with the Duke during a difficult night, and she had not been in the bedchamber when Lady Beatrice came with the broth. She had written a note in the margin of that entry, acknowledging the gap and its reason. A gap acknowledged was better than a gap discovered. She set the notebook on the desk to her left, opened to the first page. She took out a fresh sheet of paper from the writing case she always carried. She uncapped her pen. She had been deciding, for the past hour on the road to the village, how to address the letter. The county directory at the inn had confirmed what she had already believed from the article she had read 2 years ago. Inspector Frederick Oakes worked from the county constabulary offices in the county seat, 11 miles north of Graufeld. The article, which had been published in a medical journal because it had involved the wrongful certification of a death by a physician and the subsequent criminal investigation, had described Oakes as a man of careful method and considerable persistence, and had noted that his willingness to pursue a case that involved the medical profession at its most protective had been remarked upon by several people in a position to know. Clara had read that article and filed it away in the place where she kept things that might be useful, because filing things that might be useful was one of the habits that had made her very good at her work over 20 years. She wrote, "Inspector Oakes, I am writing to you from the Anchor Inn in Graufeld, where I have taken a room this morning after being dismissed from my position as nursing sister in the household of Duke Edmund Harlow at Aldenmore Castle. I was dismissed because I stated what I believed to be true about the cause of the Duke's illness. I am writing this letter because I believe the Duke is in serious and immediate danger, and because I have reason to think the danger is not of a medical nature in the ordinary sense of the word." She wrote it plainly, without preamble, and without any attempt to make it sound more credible than the facts she was about to set out would make it. She understood that the first paragraph of a letter of this kind was either a reason for the reader to continue, or a reason for the reader to stop, and that the reason to continue was not eloquence or urgency, but specificity. Specific things, stated plainly, said by someone who gave their name and their profession and their location, were harder to dismiss than general things said with great feeling by an anonymous person. She wrote the full account of her 22 days at Aldenmore in the order in which the days had occurred, beginning with her arrival and her first examination of the patient, and the first observation she had made that did not match the cardiac diagnosis. She wrote about the trembling in his hands and the specific quality of that trembling. She wrote about the mottling on the skin of the neck and upper chest, describing its location, its color, its distribution, and its duration. She wrote about the hair loss, which she noted was not a feature of any cardiac presentation she had encountered in 20 years of nursing. She wrote about the Duke's consciousness and the specific quality of his worst periods of diminishment. Then she wrote about the mornings. She described the 15 mornings she had observed with particular attention, and she was meticulous here, because the mornings were the center of everything. She described the time of Lady Beatrice's daily arrival with the broth, which was consistent across all 15 mornings to within a range of 10 minutes. She described the duration of the Duchess's stay, which ranged from 12 to 20 minutes but averaged around 15. She described the fact that Lady Beatrice brought the cup herself and removed it herself on all 15 occasions, without delegating either task. She noted that this was not the household practice for any other meal or beverage provided to the Duke, all of which were delivered by kitchen or household staff. She then set down, morning by morning, the observations she had made in the hour following the broth. The increased trembling, noted every morning. The dimming of consciousness, noted every morning. The change in the Duke's color and in the quality of his breathing. The deepened sleep that followed. She gave the times of each observation to the nearest 5 minutes. She noted that the same pattern had not occurred on any morning when, for one reason or another, the broth had not been provided. There had been 2 such mornings. On the 11th day, when she had not been present, and on the 19th day, when the broth had been delayed because Beatrice had had an early visitor from the village, and the morning had been disrupted. On those 2 mornings the Duke had had the same difficult, fragile quality he always had, but without the specific deterioration that followed the broth on the other mornings. She wrote about Birmingham. She wrote about Henry Croft, and about Dr. Charles Aldred, and about the pattern on Henry's skin, and the tests that had been ordered, and what those tests had found. She wrote the name of the specific compound that Aldred had identified in Henry's case, and she wrote it clearly and without hedging, because she was not presenting it as a diagnosis, she was presenting it as a reference point, and the reference point was verifiable by anyone who cared to check the court records of the relevant trial, which were public documents. She noted that she was not providing a diagnosis of the Duke's condition, because she was a nursing sister and not a physician, but that the similarities between what she had observed in Henry Croft's case and what she was observing at Aldenmore were, in her professional judgment, sufficiently significant to warrant independent clinical assessment. She wrote about Dr. Finn. She was very careful here. She did not say that Finn was dishonest. She did not say that he was in any way complicit in what she believed was happening to the Duke. She said only what she had observed directly, that he had dismissed the modeling with an explanation she had found inadequate on medical grounds, that he had ordered no investigative tests in 6 weeks of treating the patient, and that when she had asked him a direct question about the possibility of external compounds in the Duke's system, his physical response had been inconsistent with the verbal certainty of his answer. She described the physical response precisely, the left eye tightening, the shift of the hands, the half-second pause. She said she noted it here, not as proof of anything, but as an observation that a more qualified person might find significant. She wrote about her dismissal. She described the sequence of events from the moment she had spoken in the corridor to the moment the front door had closed behind her. She did not describe it dramatically. She described it as a sequence of events, with times and persons, the way she wrote everything, and the sequence spoke for itself without any help from her. She wrote about the coffin maker. She wrote that a craftsman from Graufeld named George Pennock had been summoned to Aldenmore to take measurements for the Duke's casket on this morning, while the Duke was still alive and still breathing, and that Pennock had been present in the room when she made her statement, and that he was available as a witness to what was said, and to the physical evidence she had shown him at the time. She wrote his name and his place of business. She wrote that he was a man of 40 years in his profession, and that she trusted his account of what he had seen would be reliable and straightforward. She signed her name in full, with her nursing registration number, and the name of her order, and the address of the inn. She dated it, and she blotted the page, and she set it aside. Then she took out a second piece of paper and wrote a shorter letter to the head of her order in Birmingham, explaining where she was and why, describing the situation in the same clear terms, and asking 2 specific questions. What was the order's position on a nursing sister providing testimony in a civil investigation? And were there legal advisory resources available to sisters who found themselves in circumstances of this kind? She was not asking for rescue. She was asking for information, which was what she always asked for, because information was what she could use. She sealed both letters and went downstairs and gave them to the innkeeper and asked that they be sent with the next post, and she paid for the postage without being asked, because she was not going to leave anything to chance. The innkeeper said the post collection was in 90 minutes and that both letters would be on it. She thanked him. She went into the dining room and ordered a meal, because she had not eaten properly since the previous evening, and she needed to think clearly, and thinking clearly required, among other things, adequate food. She sat alone at a table by the window and watched the village square in the gray November afternoon, and ate methodically, and she thought about the letter as it sat in its envelope on the innkeeper's counter, and she thought about what happened next. What happened next depended on whether Oakes believed her enough to act, and on how quickly he acted, and on whether what he found when he looked was enough to change what was happening at Aldenmore. None of these things were in her control now. She had written everything she had observed, as clearly and as precisely as she knew how to write it, and it was out of her hands, and the only thing that was left to her was to stay in Graufeld and be available to anyone who needed to speak with her, and to not go anywhere that would make her harder to find. She finished her meal. She went back upstairs and took off her coat and sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself, for perhaps 3 minutes, to think about the Duke's trembling hands on the coverlet of the bed at Aldenmore, and about what tomorrow morning would bring up those stairs, and about what would happen to those hands, and to the stubborn thin breath beneath them, if what was in her letter did not reach the right person quickly enough. She allowed herself to think about it for 3 minutes, which was as long as thinking about things you could not control was useful. Then she stood up and sat at the writing desk and began to read the notebook again from the beginning. because the only useful thing she could do now was be completely ready for whatever came next. She would stay in Graufeld for as long as it took. She would not go home before this was over. Inspector Frederick Oakes read the letter standing at his office window, which was not his habit. He was a man who sat at his desk with his tea and read things with the deliberate, patient method that 30 years of investigative work had made instinctive. He sat down when he received documents because standing made people feel urgency, and urgency made people rush, and rushing was the thing that had ruined more investigations than he could count in his 30 years. He sat down for everything. He stood for this. He had been handed the letter by his constable Henry Marsh at 9:20 on a Wednesday morning, and Henry had said only that it had come from the Anchor Inn in Graufeld, and that the woman at the reception desk had described the woman who left it as a nursing sister in very good order, which was the innkeeper's wife's way of saying that she had been a credible and serious person. Oakes had taken the letter and stood at the window because the light was better there, and he had begun to read, and he had not sat down. He read it from beginning to end, without stopping, which took 11 minutes. He read it the way he read everything that interested him, completely, without forming conclusions until the end, suppressing the particular kind of impatience that useful information always created in him, that feeling of wanting to stop reading and act before he had finished reading. He suppressed it until the last sentence. Then he read the whole letter again. There were two things that told him, as he read, that what he was holding was not the letter of a frightened or confused person. The first was the structure. The letter was organized chronologically, beginning with the writer's arrival and moving forward in order, and within each entry, it made the same structural distinction. This is what I observed, this is the date, this is the time. What I concluded from this observation is separate from the observation itself, and I will tell you when I am concluding and when I am observing. That distinction, maintained across 6 pages, was not the product of emotional distress. It was the product of training and discipline, and the habit of a person who had spent 20 years knowing that the difference between what you see and what you believe matters enormously. The second thing was the Birmingham case. She had given him a name, a date, a compound, a verifiable set of court records. She had not said the same thing was happening at Aldenmore. She had said she had observed similarities that she believed warranted attention. The distinction between those two statements was the distinction between a person trying to convince you of something and a person trying to give you enough information to reach your own conclusion. He put the letter on his desk and picked up his pen and began to write. He wrote 3 letters in 20 minutes, which was faster than he usually wrote anything. The first was to Clara Whitmore at the Anchor Inn, acknowledging receipt of her letter and asking her to remain in Graufeld and to preserve the notebook in her possession until further contact. The second was to Henry Marsh, asking him to go to the inn and speak with Clara Whitmore in person, and to listen to everything she said, and to return with the notebook if she would give it voluntarily. The third letter was to Professor Leonard Carew at the university, and it enclosed a transcript of the specific paragraphs in Clara's letter that described the physical symptoms she had observed, and it asked Carew to read the description and tell Oakes, in plain language, what he made of it. He sent Henry with all 3 letters, told him to ride hard, and then sat at his desk and thought. The particular difficulty was the structure of the situation. A grand house, a titled family, a physician of 18 years standing, with an unblemished record, a nursing sister who had been dismissed. The nursing sister's letter against the physician's diagnosis. In ordinary circumstances, without further evidence, the physician's diagnosis was the evidence, and the nursing sister's letter was a grievance. Oakes understood this completely, and without resentment. He was not a man given to resentment of how things worked. He was a man who worked with how things were. What he needed was something else, and that something else was in the letter, and it was the detail about the 15 mornings, and the broth, and the specific timing correlation. That was not grievance. That was documentation. Documentation that could be checked against the observable facts of the case, if someone were in a position to observe the facts. He wrote a 4th letter, to a colleague in the county medical circle, asking a general administrative question about the Duke's known medical history, and about the professional record of Dr. Arthur Fenn. He wrote it in the language of routine administrative inquiry, and sent it with a different messenger, because he did not want the inquiry about Fenn to be traceable back to anything connected to Graufeld. Then he waited. Carew's reply came the following afternoon. Carew was a small, meticulous, extraordinarily careful man, who ran the pathology and toxicology department at the university, and who had been in Oakes's professional orbit for 12 years, and had never once given him information that was imprecise, overstated, or subsequently found to be wrong. His letter was 2 paragraphs, written in very small, very neat handwriting, and it said the following. It said that the symptom profile described in the excerpt was, in his professional judgment, entirely consistent with the prolonged ingestion of a specific compound, which he named. It said that the distribution of symptoms, the chronological pattern of their progression, the specific features of the skin presentation described, and the correlation between the timing of worsening and the administration of a substance were, taken together, a clinical picture that had very few other explanations, and that the most parsimonious explanation was the one he had named. He said he was speaking in terms of consistency and not certainty, because certainty would require physical testing of samples, which he did not have. But he said that in his 30 years of work in this area, he had seen this specific constellation of symptoms on several previous occasions, and that he would have been very surprised indeed to find, on analysis, that the compound he had named was not present. He said one more thing, in the last sentence of the second paragraph, and he underlined it. Time, he said, was a relevant variable in this case, and he wished to make that as clear as he could. Oakes read the letter twice, and went to his door, and called for Henry Marsh. Henry had returned that morning with Clara's notebook, which she had given him without hesitation, after a 2-hour conversation that Henry described as the most methodical and the most certain account of a situation he had heard from a non-professional witness in his entire career. He said she answered every question he put to her with the same quality, complete and direct, and free of any of the elaboration or self-justification that he associated with someone who was uncertain about whether they were right. He said she seemed more concerned about the Duke than about herself or her position, which was, in his experience, a reliable indicator of sincerity. Oakes read the notebook himself that evening, sitting alone at his desk. He read it from beginning to end, all 44 entries, and he noticed that the quality of the writing was exactly the same on the first entry and the last, which meant she had not been tired, or distressed, or more agitated at one point than another. She had been consistently doing the same thing across 22 days, which was exactly what she claimed. He made his decision by 8 o'clock that evening. He wrote a brief note to Harold Bates at Aldenmore Castle, identifying himself as a county inspector pursuing a routine administrative matter related to estate documentation, and asking whether he might send 2 of his officers to conduct a brief land survey over the next few days. It was a cover story thin enough that a careful person would see through it, but Oakes had reasons to believe, from Henry's account of his conversation with Clara, that Harold Bates was a careful person who, if he saw through the story, would understand exactly what was behind it, and would cooperate, rather than complicate it. He was right. Harold's reply came the next morning, very brief, saying that the castle grounds were at the officer's disposal, and that he would arrange access to the relevant records and areas. He did not ask any questions in the letter. The not asking was itself a kind of answer. 2 officers went to Aldenmore on a Thursday morning, in plain clothes, in an unmarked carriage, carrying the kind of general-purpose equipment that a land survey might require. Harold met them at the back entrance, not the front, which told them everything they needed to know about what kind of situation they were in. He spent an hour with them in his office, speaking quietly and carefully, telling them what he had observed, and what he had concluded, and what he had done, and notably, what he had not done. And he said the last part without flinching from his own account of himself, which Oakes, when the report came back to him, noted as a characteristic of someone who was telling the truth about something that did not entirely reflect well on themselves. Harold also told them about Hattie. Hattie was the youngest kitchen maid, 17 years old, who had made a decision that she had not been authorized to make, and that she had not told anyone about until this moment. She had, 4 days ago, exchanged the contents of the small blue bottle on the Duke's bedside table, the daily tonic prescribed by Dr. Fenn, for a bottle filled with water that she had prepared herself. She had done this in the middle of the night, alone, with the particular quiet that a girl who has grown up in a large family develops, the ability to move through a sleeping house without waking anyone. She had taken the original bottle and wrapped it in cloth and buried it in the corner of the kitchen garden, under the old pear tree, in a spot she had marked with a piece of white stone. She explained all of this to Harold, and to the two officers, with the straightforward courage of someone who has already made their peace with the consequences and is not retreating from the decision. She said that she had heard Dorothy talking in the kitchen, and she had heard Sister Whitmore before she left, and that she had spent 2 nights lying awake thinking about the straight line between the bottle and the mornings, and that on the 3rd night she had gotten up and done something about it, because she could not go on lying in her bed doing nothing, while the thing that she believed was true continued to be true. Harold looked at her after she finished. He said he was very glad she had done what she did. He said it simply, and he meant it completely, and she nodded, and said she hoped she had not done wrong. The original bottle was retrieved from under the pear tree the following morning, and sent to Carew. That same afternoon, for the first time in 47 days, Duke Edmund Harlow opened his eyes on his own initiative, without being prompted, and looked at the ceiling of his room with the clear and focused gaze of a man who has returned from somewhere far away and is taking stock of where he has arrived. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he turned his head toward the window. Then he said, in a voice that was rough and thin but entirely coherent, "I would very much like a glass of water." Harold was in the room. He had made it his practice to be in the room several times each day since Clara's dismissal, finding administrative reasons to enter, staying as long as was reasonable. He was there when the Duke spoke, and he brought the water, and he sat in the chair beside the bed, in the chair that had been Clara's chair, and he watched the Duke drink, and felt something that he had not felt in a very long time, and could not quite name, except that it was something in the direction of hope. Beatrice came in 30 minutes later, as she always did at that hour, and she saw the Duke's eyes open and clear, and his head raised slightly on the pillow, and something crossed her face in the moment before she composed it. Harold watched her face in that moment. He stored what he saw. She said Edmund's name with the warmth of a devoted wife, and she came to the bedside and took his hand, and she said this was wonderful. This was such good news, they would send for Dr. Fenn immediately. The Duke looked at her with his clear, tired eyes and said yes, send for Fenn, and then he looked away toward the window and appeared to be thinking about something. 3 days later he asked Harold for his newspaper. Harold brought it to him, and stood beside the bed while he read the front page, and the Duke read it with the slow, effortful attention of a man whose strength was not fully returned, but whose mind was clear, and Harold stood beside him, and said nothing, and felt, very quietly, that the situation had changed, and that the change was going to be enough. The loose board was in the dressing room. Henry Marsh found it on the 2nd afternoon of the search, which was a Thursday, while Lady Beatrice was downstairs in the east drawing room with Lord Cecil and his solicitors for one of the afternoon meetings that had become a regular fixture of the past 2 weeks. Henry had been moving through the private rooms of the East Wing with the methodical patience that Oakes had trained him to bring to physical searches. Start from the outside of each room and work toward the center. Look for things that are slightly different from what they should be. Not obviously different, just slightly. Because people who hide things in their own homes are not usually careless about it, but they cannot always help the small irregularities that time and repeated access produce. He had been through 2 rooms before the dressing room and found nothing. The dressing room was lined with pale wooden-fitted closets on 3 walls, and a tall mirror on the 4th, and the floor was covered with a pale cream carpet that was relatively new, newer than the carpet in the rest of the East Wing, which was old and well-worn. Henry noticed the carpet. He noticed it with the particular attention of someone who has learned that new things in old houses require explanation. He walked across the carpet slowly, pressing slightly with each step, and he found the loose board on his 3rd crossing, on the far side of the room near the left-hand closet. The board gave under his foot with a sound so slight it would have been inaudible to anyone not listening for exactly that. He stood still on it for a moment. Then he knelt down and ran his fingers along the edge of the carpet, found where it lifted at the baseboard, and folded it back carefully, a small triangle of pale carpet revealing the old floorboard beneath. The board moved when he pressed the corner. He did not have to force it, which told him it had been opened and closed regularly, and that whatever held it in place was designed to make it look secure, rather than actually be secure. He lifted it with his gloved hands, slowly, and set it against the closet behind him. The space beneath was shallow, no more than 6 inches between the board and the stone below, just enough for a small tin box with a brass clasp. The box was not locked. Henry picked it up with both hands and set it on the floor in front of him and opened the clasp. Inside were three things. The first was a small glass vial, sealed with a wax stopper, containing a white powder. Henry held it to the light from the window. He did not open it. He placed it carefully on the floor beside the box. The second was a piece of paper, folded into quarters. He unfolded it carefully, and found a handwritten document that was divided into a grid, a schedule of some kind, with dates in the left column and quantities in the center column, and a column on the right that had check marks beside most of the dates. The dates ran from 7 weeks ago to 5 days ago, and the quantities were written in a unit he did not recognize but which he understood, looking at the regularity and the incremental variations in the numbers to be a measurement of some kind. The handwriting was small and precise, and entirely consistent across every entry, written by the same hand, in the same pen, over the same period, which meant it was a contemporaneous record, not something written after the fact. He recognized the handwriting from the household correspondence he had been shown by Harold Bates. He had no doubt about it. The third was a bundle of letters, tied with a dark ribbon, perhaps 11 of them. Henry undid the ribbon and looked at the envelope of the topmost letter. The return address was in Zurich, Switzerland. The name on the return address was Philip Cross. He read the first letter where he knelt, on the floor of the dressing room with the November light coming through the window above him, and then he read the second, and then he read enough of the third to understand the full shape of what he was holding, and he sat back on his heels and stayed very still for a moment. The letters from Philip Cross described, across a correspondence of 2 years, a plan. They described it in the language of people who know what they are writing should not be written, which meant many things were not said directly, but the pattern of what was said and the pattern of what was implied made the meaning clear enough that a person of ordinary understanding could follow it. There were references to timing. There were references to arrangements and to outcomes. There were references, in several letters, to what Cross called the necessary steps, without specifying what those steps were, but the context of the surrounding letters made the necessary steps very clear. There were references to what would happen afterward, to where Cross would be, and to what he and Beatrice had agreed about the distribution of what she described, in her replies as quoted within his letters, as the estate once it was settled. Henry put the letters back in their envelope order and retied the ribbon. He put everything back in the tin box and closed the clasp, gently, and stood up and folded the carpet back over the board. He carried the box downstairs to Harold's office and knocked and went in, and Harold looked up from his desk and looked at the tin box in Henry's hands and said nothing for a moment. Henry said, "I found this under the dressing room floor. I need you to note the time and witness that I have not opened anything that was sealed when I found it." Harold noted the time in his ledger. He witnessed it as Henry had asked. Then Henry asked Harold whether there was a way to reach Inspector Oakes by telegraph, and Harold said yes, and went with Henry to the estate office where the telegraph equipment was, and Henry sent the message himself. Oakes arrived at Aldenmore the following morning with 2 additional constables and Professor Carew, who had come from the university by an early train and had been waiting at the county offices since the previous evening, unwilling to delay once Oakes had told him what they had found. Carew was a small man who moved quickly and whose efficiency of motion reflected the efficiency of his mind. He was in Harold's office within 20 minutes of arriving, with the tin box open on the table in front of him. He took the vial from the box and held it to the window and looked at it for a long time. He asked Harold for a clean glass and for a small amount of water. He opened the vial and used the tip of a pencil to transfer a tiny fraction of the powder to the glass of water. He observed the result for several minutes. He put a small amount of the solution on the back of his hand and looked at it. He performed 2 other brief tests with items from the kit he had carried from the university, and he noted the results in a small hardback notebook he took from his coat pocket. Then he closed his notebook and looked at Oakes and said, "It is what I named in my letter." He said it without elaboration and without drama, in the flat, certain tone of a man who is reporting a finding he expected to make and finds no satisfaction in having been correct. He said, "There is no question." He said, "The concentration in the vial is consistent with the pattern of dosage on the schedule." Oakes looked at the schedule, and at the vial, and at the notebook that Carew had put back in his pocket, and then he said to Henry, "We will go to Fenn first." They drove to the village and stopped at Fenn's surgery, which was a small stone building at the end of the main street with a brass plate beside the door. Fenn was in. He was at his desk, working on patient notes, and when Henry opened the surgery door and Oakes stepped in behind him, Fenn looked up from his desk and looked at them, and a great deal happened in his face, in the space of perhaps 3 seconds. It was not guilt, exactly, or not only guilt. It was the look of a man who has been holding a very heavy thing for a very long time, and has just heard the sound of what was holding it from the other direction give way. It was the look of inevitability arriving. He set down his pen. He looked at Oakes for a moment longer. Then he said quietly that Oakes had better sit down. He told them everything. He had been paid to maintain the cardiac diagnosis. He had been paid, initially, 4 months ago, before the illness began, in the form of an anonymous payment to a private account that he had allowed himself to believe was a pharmaceutical retainer, of the kind that some physicians accepted. He had been approached again 3 months ago by Beatrice Harlow directly, who had told him what she intended to do and what his role would be, and he had been given a choice between a great deal of money and a consequence she had described in very clear terms, involving certain information about his professional conduct in a previous employment that she had somehow obtained, and that would have ended his career immediately if it came to light. He had chosen the money. He had told himself it was the lesser wrong. He had told himself this every morning for 3 months, and had not believed it any of the mornings, but he had continued. His role had been to maintain the diagnosis, to keep the household staff from asking questions, to manage Clara Whitmore's concerns when they arose, and to ensure that no one outside the household sought a second opinion. He had not administered anything himself. He had simply ensured that the correct questions were not asked. He said this without self-pity and without the self-justification that Oakes had expected. He said it with the flat, exhausted accuracy of a man who has decided that the only thing he can still do correctly is tell the truth as completely as possible. Oakes charged him. Fenn received the charge without comment. They went back to Aldenmore. Lady Beatrice Harlow was on the main staircase when they came through the front door, coming down for supper at exactly 7 o'clock, as she always came down, wearing a dark green evening dress, her hair perfectly arranged, moving with the measured composure that had been the signature of every public moment of her 4 years at Aldenmore. Harold was in the entrance hall below, and he had known they were coming, and he was standing with his hands at his sides in the particular still attention that Harold brought to moments that required witnessing. Beatrice came down 3 steps and saw them. She stopped. She looked at Oakes and at Henry, and at the 2 additional constables behind them, and then she looked at Harold, and her face in that moment was the most unguarded Harold had ever seen it. For perhaps 2 seconds it was fully open, showing something underneath the composure that was not quite fear, and not quite defeat, but was a private reckoning of some kind, the expression of a person who has been running a very long calculation, and has just reached the final sum, and found it to be exactly what she knew it would be. Then the composure came back, complete and perfect, like water closing over a stone. Oakes said her name. He said she was being detained for questioning in connection with a matter under investigation. He said it in the formal language of the procedure, and she listened to it without responding. She looked, in that moment, almost relieved, which was the thing that Harold would think about afterward, sometimes, in the quiet of his office, the relief in her face when the waiting was finally over. She walked down the remaining steps and out through the front door between the constables, and she held her head in exactly the way she always held it, and she did not speak to anyone, and the front door closed behind her. The carriage went down the long drive through the dark November evening, and Harold watched it from the doorway, and then he went upstairs to the Duke's room. The Duke was awake and reading his newspaper. He had been reading his newspaper every evening for the past 4 days, which had become, in Harold's private accounting, the most reassuring thing he had ever watched a person do. He looked up when Harold came in, and he saw Harold's face, and he said, "Tell me." Harold told him. He told it fully and in order, the way he had always done everything, and the Duke listened without interrupting. And when Harold finished, the room was very quiet, and the Duke looked at the window for a while, at the dark November evening beyond the glass. His hands lay on the coverlet. They were still trembling, slightly, but less than they had been, less than yesterday. He said, without looking away from the window, "What is Clara Whitmore doing right now?" Harold said she was at the Anchor Inn in Graufeld, where she had been for 9 days. The Duke was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "Bring her here tomorrow morning, please, Harold. I should very much like to thank her." Harold said he would. He left the room and closed the door softly behind him and stood in the corridor for a moment and breathed, slowly and carefully. And the old house was quiet around him. And from downstairs came the distant sounds of Dorothy in the kitchen, preparing a supper that might, for the first time in many weeks, be eaten by a man who was genuinely getting better. And Harold stood in the corridor and let himself believe it. Duke Edmund Harlow ate a full breakfast for the first time in 49 days on a Friday morning in late November, and Dorothy the cook stood at the kitchen door with the serving dish in her hands and wept, very quietly and without apparent embarrassment, into her apron. She collected herself in under a minute, which was about the time Dorothy always allowed herself for private emotion, before returning to the business of being useful. And then she went back to the range and began preparing the Duke's mid-morning broth in the manner she had always prepared it, before anything had changed, with good stock and a little pepper and the small piece of fresh parsley that she placed on the top of every cup she sent upstairs to a sick patient, because she believed it did something for the spirit, even if the medicine books had no opinion on the matter. The recovery was not fast, because the Duke's body had spent nearly 7 weeks under an assault that it had not been equipped to identify or resist, and the effects of that kind of assault do not simply disappear when the cause is removed. They diminish, gradually and unevenly, with better days and worse days, with mornings of surprising clarity, followed by afternoons of exhaustion, with the particular cruelty of a body that is trying to recover and sometimes runs out of the energy required to keep trying. But the direction was clear, and the direction did not change. Each week was better than the week before. By mid-December, the trembling in his hands had reduced significantly. By the new year he was walking the length of the upper corridor each morning, assisted by a walking stick and the arm of the nursing sister that Clara had recommended from her order, a strong and cheerful woman named Frances, who brought with her none of the complicated history of the previous weeks, and who simply got on with the work, which was what the Duke needed. Clara came to Aldenmore the morning after the arrest and sat with the Duke for an hour, and the conversation was, by both their accounts afterward, not long or complicated, or particularly emotional. He thanked her. She said she had done her job. He said that her job, in this instance, had been his life. She said she understood that, and that she was glad it had been possible to do it. He asked whether there was anything he could do for her. She said that there was one thing, and she told him about a scheme she had been developing with the head of her order to establish a training fund for nursing sisters in the county, a fund that would allow candidates without private means to qualify and practice, and the Duke said he would look into it, and he did, and the fund bore his name when it was established the following spring, though Clara was not the kind of person who needed her own name on it. She went back to Birmingham and went back to her work, and the work was what it had always been: patience, observations, the careful accumulation of knowledge, and the patient application of it. She did not speak publicly about Aldenmore except when she was required to by the trial, and she spoke at the trial with the same quality she brought to everything, clearly and specifically and without anything that did not belong. The cross-examination lasted 2 hours and changed none of her answers. The trial itself opened the following spring and lasted 6 days, and attracted, as Oakes had expected it would, a great deal of attention. The county court was full for all 6 days, and newspapers sent people to report on it, and the reporting was thorough, and in some cases sensational, which was what newspapers did. The evidence was not sensational, the evidence was simply clear. The schedule from the tin box was entered into evidence. The letters from Philip Cross were entered into evidence. Professor Carew's analysis of the vial was entered into evidence. The notebook with its 44 entries was entered into evidence. Fenn's testimony was entered into evidence, which was the most difficult part of the 6 days, not because of what he said, but because of the picture it made of a professional obligation betrayed, and the court was very quiet while he spoke. Lady Beatrice Harlow was convicted of administering a harmful compound with intent and conspiracy to do the same. She was sentenced to life imprisonment at the county institution. She was taken from the court in the same way she had been taken from the staircase of Aldenmore 7 months earlier, composed and straight-backed and saying nothing. She died in the institution 14 years later, of a fever that no nursing sister who knew her history was able to observe without a particular and sobering awareness of how fates arrange themselves. Philip Cross was found in Switzerland and extradited after a process that took nearly a year and required 3 separate legal instruments and the patience of Frederick Oakes, who had patience to spare. He was tried separately and received a lighter sentence than the prosecution had sought, which was the usual outcome of cases that crossed international jurisdictions and required so many procedural compromises that the justice at the end was a thinner version of itself than it had started out being. Oakes was not satisfied with it, but he accepted it, because acceptance was the professional discipline that 30 years had given him, and which he would not have traded for anything. Dr. Arthur Fenn lost his medical license and was not sent to prison, which many people in the county and in the medical profession felt was incorrect, and which Oakes felt was correct. And the difference in their views reflected something real about how people weigh different kinds of wrong. Fenn's testimony had been given freely and completely and without any legal inducement, and the cooperation it had provided had been essential to the prosecution's case. Oakes had made the recommendation to the prosecution, and he stood by it. Fenn left the county before the summer, moved away from everything he knew, and was not heard of in any of the circles that Harold or Clara or George Pennock moved in for as long as any of them were paying attention. Lord Cecil Harlow left Aldenmore the morning after the arrest, and he left with more speed than his 3 leather trunks suggested he had planned for. His solicitors were gone before breakfast. Harold watched the carriage go from the entrance hall window at 7:30 in the morning, and felt a very clean and simple feeling that he could not immediately name, and then recognized as the feeling of a house returning to itself. Cecil would write to his brother twice a year, at the appropriate intervals, in letters that were formal and civil, and carried inside them the particular careful distance of someone who knows they have been observed at their worst, and is managing the long-term relationship accordingly. He and Edmund would not meet in person for several years. Oliver Harlow arrived at Aldenmore in December, alone, in a hired carriage, on a morning when the grounds were white with the first proper frost of the winter. He had not written ahead. He had simply come. Harold met him at the door and took his coat and showed him upstairs, and when Harold opened the Duke's door and Oliver stepped in, and the Duke looked up from the newspaper he had been reading, and the two of them looked at each other across the room, Harold closed the door quietly and left them to it. He never asked about the conversation, because it was not his business, and he had come, in the months since everything had changed, to feel very clearly the line between what was his business and what was not, a line he had not always kept as well as he should have. Oliver was still at Aldenmore at supper, and still there the following day, and the day after that, and when he went back to London, he had the look of a man who had recovered something he had believed was permanently lost, and was still deciding what it meant to have it back. He came again at Christmas, and again in February, and by the summer he was at Aldenmore more than he was in London, and the relationship between him and his father was not the same as it had been before the estrangement, because 7 years of absence changed the shape of a relationship even when the people in it come back to each other. But it was genuine, and it was growing, and it was the kind of thing that both of them were careful with in the way that you are careful with something you know to be breakable and valuable. The Duke walked the south lawns for the first time in February, on a cold and clear afternoon, with a stick in his right hand, and Frances the nursing sister at his elbow, and he went slowly, and he did not go as far as he used to go, and he came back sooner than he once would have. Harold was in the estate office when they came back in, and he heard the sound of the front door, and the sound of the Duke's stick on the stone floor of the entrance hall, and he stood up from his desk, without knowing he was going to stand, and then he stood there for a moment, and then he sat back down, and picked up his pen, and went on with his work, but the feeling in his chest was one he was glad to have. Dorothy made a special supper that evening, because she felt that the Duke's first time back on the lawns deserved a special supper, and because Dorothy's response to all significant events was to express them through food, which was the right response for someone in her position. She made everything he liked. She sent it up on the good china. She heard, from George the footman when he came back down with the trays, that the Duke had eaten all of it, and she stood in her kitchen alone for a moment, with her hands flat on the range, and felt something that she had been waiting to feel for 7 months. Harold Bates served at Aldenmore for 11 more years after everything that had happened, and in those 11 years he was a steward who was, by his own account and everyone else's, exceptionally good at his job. He was precise and thorough and loyal and attentive, and he kept the ledgers in perfect order and managed the correspondence without error, and ran the household with the calibrated efficiency that a house like Aldenmore required. But he was also, in those 11 years, a slightly different kind of steward than he had been in the 12 years before. He was a man who had learned where the line was, and who had learned it in a way that cost him something, and who had resolved, quietly and completely, not to stay on the wrong side of it again. He sometimes thought about the 42 mornings of stable and resting, and no significant change, and about the day he had opened Oliver Harlow's letter, and about what he had done with what he knew and what he had not done. He did not punish himself for any of it, because punishment was not useful, and he was a practical man, but he kept it, in the way that you keep things that have taught you something important, as a kind of measure he could check himself against when the situations of his work put a similar line in front of him. George Pennock returned to Graufeld and went back to his work, and when people in the village asked him about Aldenmore, he said he had been there, and he had put his rope away, and that everything else was other people's business to tell. He said it without false modesty, and without any attempt to diminish what had happened, but with the straightforward belief of a man who knows his own role in a story, and is clear about its edges. He completed work that autumn and winter that he was very proud of, a set of 3 matched pieces for a family in the next village, made of well-seasoned oak, with joinery he had spent years perfecting, work that was exactly what it was supposed to be, and nothing more or less. He found great satisfaction in that. Ned Briggs thought about Aldenmore for the rest of his life, which was a long one. He left the coffin-making trade at 21 and went to work in the county offices as a junior clerk, and he rose through those offices steadily, and with the particular competence of a man who notices everything and forgets nothing, and says what he has noticed at the right moment, in the right way. He worked in the county offices for 38 years, and was, by the end of them, a person of considerable local significance, who was known, among the people who worked with him, and the people who reported to him, for a very specific professional habit. He always asked what had been observed before he asked what had been concluded. He said this was the most important distinction in any kind of work, and when people asked him where he had learned it, he said he had learned it in a kitchen in Graufeld when he was 17, sitting at the end of a table listening to a cook tell the truth about something, and in a room at the top of a castle, watching a nursing sister do the same. The south garden was replanted in the spring. A specialist came from Derbyshire, and spent 2 weeks redesigning the beds, and brought with him several varieties of climbing rose that he planted against the old stone wall on the southern boundary. The Duke came out to see the planting on the second day, and stood beside the wall for a while, and then went back inside, and by June the roses were beginning to grow, and by August they were doing what roses do when they have good stone, and good soil, and enough light, which is to grow with a quiet, unhurried determination that does not make a great deal of noise about itself, but is visible in the result. Harold watched them from his office window on fine mornings, as he watched everything from that window, because the window had a long view of the south lawns, and the old walls and the sky above them, and Harold was a man who liked to know what was happening in the grounds he was responsible for. The roses were doing well. The lawns were green and open and wide, and the afternoon light in early autumn lay across them in the long golden lines that this particular latitude produced at this particular time of year, the kind of light that makes old things look like themselves, as though the light has known them for a long time and is glad to see them. On the first clear afternoon of October, the Duke walked the full length of the south lawns without his stick. Harold happened to be at the window when he did it. He saw the Duke come out of the south door and walk across the terrace and down onto the lawns, and move along the old gravel path that ran the length of the property, steady and unhurried, and he walked the whole length of it and came back, and he stood for a moment on the terrace at the end of the walk and looked at the sky. Then he went back inside. Harold stood at the window for a long time after he had gone. Then he picked up his pen and went back to the accounts, because the accounts were there and required his attention, and attending to what was required was the discipline that 12 years of service had given him, and that he had never, even in the hardest months, entirely set aside. The house was quiet. The fire in the east drawing-room was lit. The kitchen was producing the pleasant sounds and smells of a supper being prepared with care and skill, and the knowledge of exactly who was going to eat it and what they liked. The lawns were still and pale and wide in the October afternoon, and the roses were finished for the year now, quiet against the old stone wall, and the stone was exactly as it had always been, and the sky above it was wide and gray, and entirely indifferent to the past and the present and everything in between, as the sky always is, and as the old stone always is, and as certain kinds of truth always are, patient and permanent, and waiting to be named by whoever is finally willing to say the words out loud.